Right now, decisions around development on the lower Fraser River are controlled almost exclusively by the Ottawa-appointed Port Metro Vancouver. Regional impact to the port's decision-making is minimal, and regional opposition to development proposals along the river is largely ignored. Similarly, decisions around the rail line going through South Surrey White Rock are controlled by Transport Canada. Local needs and community input is not factored into policies, regulations, and decision-making. The question, as a local MP and as part of Canada's next government, what would you do to change how Canada's port authorities, Transport Canada, and other federal departments are run, if any, in order for them to better reflect local concerns in their decision-making process?
I've mentioned about Transport Canada and how they need to be strengthened and given more power. As for the port, experience shows us that the port, Transport Canada, and BNSF Railway cannot be relied upon to safeguard Canadians in their current form, let alone the planet. So on many occasions they've been willing to withhold information and have even at times purposely misled the public. Whatever they say at this point cannot be trusted at face value. Fortunately, a growing number of people in this community are starting to question their so-called facts and misleading reports. The Port of Vancouver insists they have the right to make a unilateral decision and to ignore the 9 municipalities and 8 MLAs who either outright reject their proposal or demand a full health impact assessment. Their board of directors seem to feel that they operate in a bubble, but the port itself does not, and they have a huge impact on all of the communities around them. At the very least, the port has a responsibility to properly assess the impact of their business before making a decision that will affect us all. Instead, they blatantly shirk that responsibility and make things worse by orchestrating a charade to make it appear that they consulted the public and adequately assessed the health and environmental impacts. The port's board of directors is appointed by the federal government, which is an indication of the gaping disconnect between our national government and its citizens. Our government has turned against us and has become a reckless promoter of business at any cost. I think we have to look very carefully at how this current government was elected and take a look at the damage that they have done to the foundations of our democracy. Thank you.
The question asks what I would do as a part of the next government, meaning as an MP in the next parliament. And I think that's important. We elect members of parliament, not parties, not movements, not prime ministers, and not people who are simply there to do what the PMO tells us we should be doing. What would I do to change how Canada's port authorities, Transport Canada, and other federal departments are run in order to reflect local concerns in the decision-making processes? Well, to begin with, I'd restore the role of government departments as advisors to the government, suppliers of information as public policy is formed. The role to enforce public policy, codes of conduct in industry and individuals for the public good needs to be restored. The Harper government sees no government agencies and bureaucrats, the Harper government sees government agencies and bureaucrats as apparatchiks enforcing its agenda. We see that in every area down to and including the Parliamentary Budget Officer and the Veterans Ombudsman, and not just in Transport Canada. Refuse that role and you're removed. Like the long-form census and Stats Canada, information that does not conform with the Harper government's agenda is not welcome. Port Metro Vancouver and the departments within Transport Canada concerned with the decisions around the rail line in our community, South Surrey White Rock, I suspect are no different. We need a change of political culture, perhaps not back to the days when bureaucratic mandarins were charged with looking at the stain at the ministers and members of parliament in our democracy, but with an eye first to public interest and openness cooperatively with the people's interest and in a public policy informed by you, partly public consultation, but also with a duty to listen to everyone, not just political supporters or moneyed interests, as we build a stronger Canada. Thank you.
You know, I believe that, first of all, we have to restore credibility to any type of growth or action in on our railroad tracks. For example, restore credibility to our environmental assessments, which is one criterion. We have to restore safety too, because over the years, they have really not looked at safety issues in that the trains have gotten longer and longer, far more dangerous, and quite frankly, they haven't added anything on there to make it safer. Lac Megantic, they say, was perhaps human error. That's not good enough. When we look at how we deal with our trains, and we know that they've cut off Crescent Beach at certain points when the trains go around the tracks. And, you know, these trains should not be going through small areas. How do we restore credibility to the whole process? Well, local governments should appoint some directors to the various agencies and the board of directors on Port Metro. Most of the directors there are appointed by the federal government on the Port Metro, and we have a couple of people that have served on those committees over time. I believe Penny Pretty is now serving on as the municipal appointment on Surrey Fraser Docks at this point as we speak. We need more there, and we need the mandate for them to meet with community groups. But I believe that port authorities should have annual public meetings that involve city council representation along with community groups to give a total assessment of what is happening on there over the year and some of the challenges they have had. Because they never confess to us some of the challenges that they deal with or the cost. All I know is that when you look at passenger rail, it's like a 9 out of 10 in safety issues. When you look at putting freight through a community, it's on 6 or 7 on a scale out of 10. So that the safety issues are not as well looked after when you have some of the longer trains, more dangerous trains, and they simply don't have the safety issues looked after. So more local people on their public boards and an annual general meeting that should in fact give a voice to the community such as you.
Thank you, Judy.
For a democracy to work effectively, citizens need to participate actively, and interested parties need to have their voices heard and have their ideas and their concerns taken seriously. This is why the Harper government has failed in the most egregious way, in my respectful opinion. Okay, they have eroded Canadian democracy, and an example of that is in the decision-making process that we've seen around the approval of the Fraser-Surrey docks. I would go right away at amending the Canada Marine Act, particularly in how it relates to how the board of directors of port authorities are appointed. I would make sure that the boards had a membership that reflected all of the stakeholders in the community, not just the business interests, but the other interests as well. That is democracy at work. I would also ensure that there were mechanisms in the Act to place requirements for transparency and accountability around the decision-making process. It would have to involve a wide selection of members of the community, and the process would have to be open and transparent. I would also make sure that the National Transportation Strategy tied itself to other legislation and other mechanisms to make sure that decisions are made in an open and transparent way and that every voice in the community is heard. Anything less than that is just not democracy and just not Canadian.
I support free market capitalism. This means allowing individuals in Canada to trade with other individuals across the world without government intervention. The Port Authority is needed for security reasons and for stopping prohibited items that can harm individuals. We can privatize these jobs involving the government to third-party companies that have their own sets of rules. And like I said many times before, we will reduce the power of the federal government and give more power to the provincial and municipal governments. Thank you.
Can I say that I want to thank Pixie for mentioning democracy again. I know this session is about trains. It could just as easily be about tankers, or it could be about the economy, or whatever you want. But without that foundation of democracy, we can make no progress whatsoever. In fact, what we've seen is the exact opposite. We have regressed, I feel, since the Harper government came in, certainly. And what I would do, if elected, is to focus first on democracy, and that is my main issue in this election. It wasn't the last one as well. It was ethics, because we saw the Harper government in contempt of Parliament. That's why that 2011 election was called. And this time around, it's the same thing. We're concerned about integrity in democracy. Thank you.
I'd like to add to that, because I believe that that's true. Canada came together as a country in 1867 because the railroad came to British Columbia. Had that not happened, we probably wouldn't be a country today. We also are a federation. And a federation is a federal government, or one government, that is supposed to work with the provinces and the cities across Canada and find solutions to building a democracy. I think that over the years, in 150 years, in the year 2017, we will have our 150th birthday. And I know somewhere in about the middle, in the 1970s, when Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the Prime Minister of Canada, one of the ideas he had, and he was totally poo-pooed and almost booed out of the building, but he said, I believe that we should double-track across Canada. Had we double-tracked, and if we had double tracks, it would be far more safer and far better. And you look at the tracks like the sort of the BC Hydro right-of-way, where one of my favorite railroads is where they have the little Heritage Rail Society. And they now have, it's over 100 feet in width. You could put 3 different tracks on there and still not really impact other areas or land. You can use some of the existing railroad track areas. So I think that it's something that we have to think of when we go into the future, is how can we make best use of what we had, and how can we do it in the way that the Federation was built to work together and build a stronger Canada.
There's something I want to add here. The BNA Act 1867-3031 Victoria C3, as it's properly called, declares that whereas the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have expressed their desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar in principle to the United Kingdom, and whereas such a union would conduce to the welfare of the provinces under the interests of the British Empire, and whereas at the time of the Union it is expedient that the legislative authority be provided for and the nature of the executive declared. And it then goes on in section 17 to describe Parliament as the Queen, an upper house style the Senate, and the House of Commons. That defines both the nature of Canadian federalism and the nature of Canada's Parliament. I think one of the big concerns we're not confronting tonight so much, but is implicit in everything that we've said here, is the role and the nature of Canadian federalism. It is, in essence, a form of federalism that embraces both the unitary state and the nature of federal powers. The Prime Minister of Australia, when he first encountered our model, described it as a mongrel democracy, or mongrel federalism. Well, it meets Canadian conditions. It did then, it does now, and we need to ensure that the Constitution of Canada, the Parliament of Canada, and our parliamentary democracy are secure.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.